My discussion today is about the immigration journey of my maternal grandmother. The title of the story is From Russia with Love, or How Gramma Anastazja Got to America. The significance of the church you see in the virtual background I am using today will become evident in the next few moments. First, a little background about my grandmother, Anastazja Gemborys. She was born in the small village of Pasieki, which means beehive in English. This was near the larger town of Tomaszów-Lubelski, and we'll learn more about the geography of the location in a few moments. Interestingly enough, she actually has two birth dates. 10 February 1889 was her official birth record. According to the Julian calendar, which was in use in the region where she was born in 1889. However, according to the modern, more accurate celestial calendar, the Gregorian calendar, her real birth date was 22 February 1889. She was the second born of 10 children, 9 girls, 1 boy. Similar to her duality of birth record, she had dual heritage. Ethnically, she was Polish, but her nationality was Russian. She was born under the reign of Tsar Alexander III, who reigned from 1881 to 1894. But most of her childhood and early adult years were under the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, who reigned from 1894 to 1917. If you will remember from your world history, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were the ones that were assassinated by the communists when they took over Russia in 1918. Anastazja was a petite woman. She stood only 5 feet 1 inches tall. She had blue eyes and brown hair. And interestingly to note, she died at a very young age of 36. And this was just 7 days after the birth of her 8th child. So this is Anastazja's family of origin. The man you see standing on the far left is Jakob Gemborys, Anastazja's father, or my great-grandfather. And in the foreground, the petite woman in the middle is Katarzyna Malek Gemborys. This is Anastazja's mother, or my great-grandmother. Standing next to Jakob is Anastazja's one brother, Wojciech. The 2 younger women in the front row are 2 of her sisters, and the 2 young boys are 2 of her nephews, and the 2 men on the far right in the back are Anastazja's brothers-in-law. This is Pasieki as it looks today. It's a small rural village, a very pleasant, quiet place. This is a map of Europe prior to World War I. This explains Anastazja's dual heritage. As you will note, there is no independent country of Poland on this map. You'll see the German Empire in blue, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the pinkish-orange color at the bottom, and to the right, you will see green color. That is Russia. You note Warsaw, which is now the capital of Poland, is part of Russia, as is the city of Lublin. So there was no Poland. So thus the duality of my grandmother's heritage. She was Polish by heritage, but Russian by nationality. You'll see in red that I have included the location of Tomaszów-Lubelski, near where she was born and raised. And I've also in red noted the location of the town of Nowy Targ. Nowy Targ is the location of my grandfather's birth and childhood. But this is the story of my grandmother's immigration, so we'll continue. This is the town of Tomaszów-Lubelski. I included this photo just to give you a perspective of the kind of lifestyle, the homes they lived in at the time my grandmother was born and raised. I believe this photo is probably from around 1915. I believe the troop of cavalry shown here in the zoomed in section is probably the Russian cavalry on their way to the front during World War I. This is the Church of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This is a 400-year-old, all wooden structure. So it has survived World War I, World War II, and all the other previous conflicts that occurred before that. This, in fact, is a church where my grandmother, Anastazja, was baptized and attended Mass. This is the interior of the church, and if you note in the lower center right, this is the baptismal font where I believe my grandmother was probably baptized in February 1889. This is a copy of my grandmother's official baptismal record. As you'll note, it's all in narrative form in Tsarist-era Russian script. What's interesting about this is the baptismal records were not filed according to date. They were filed according to the order in which the baptisms took place. You'll see on the upper left of the document, number 32. So my grandmother's baptism was the 32nd baptism at the Church of the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary. I contacted the Polish Genealogy Society of America located in Chicago, and they put me in touch with a translator who was able to give me the translation of this document. And it reads, this happened in the city of Tomaszów on the 12th of February in the year 1889 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Jakub Gemborys appeared personally, 28 years old, a peasant residing in the village of Pasieki, in the presence of Alexander Kitko, 40 years old, and Lukas Kitko, 38 years old, peasants residing in the village of Pasieki. And he presented to us a female child, stating that she was born in the village of Pasieki on the 10th of February in the current year at 9 o'clock in the evening to his lawful wife, Katarzyna Ni Balak, 23 years old. At the holy christening performed today, this child was given the name Anastazja, and her godparents, Alexander Kitko and Anna Yabarowska. This record was read to the declarant and witnesses, and as they are illiterate, it was signed by us. So let's get into the actual immigration of my grandmother now. This is an enlarged map of the area where she was born and raised. You'll note Pasieki in the left center. If I zoom in here, we can see that a little bit better. And you'll note that I've included a blue line here. Well, the blue line represents the most likely route that my grandmother, accompanied by her uncle, would have started their journey on their immigration to North America. Now, the area in green is Russia, and the area in the reddish tone is the province of Galicia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The blue line represents the route that they probably took, probably in mid-April of 1911. Mid-April, probably because it would have been just prior to mud season when spring hit and everything would turn to mud and travel would have been very difficult. They traveled to the village of Pare. That is significant because that is the location where Anastasia's mother, Katarzyna, was born and raised. So if they had encountered the Russian border guards in their route to Pare, they had a perfect reason for why they were going to Pare. They were going to visit relatives. Now, the Tsar at the time, even though he oppressed and persecuted the Polish population of this area, the Jewish population, and the Ukrainian population of the area, he was loath to lose any of those citizens because his wealth depended upon an annual head tax. Anyway, continuing with their journey, they probably crossed the border maybe sometime in the middle of the night under the light of the full moon, which was mid-April 1911, and then made their way a short distance east to the town of Belzig, where they would pick up the Austro-Hungarian rail line, which would then take them south, as I'll show you here on a map, of their immigration journey as it started. They left Tomasz Lubelski, headed south, I think, on the rail line from Belzec to the town of Lemberg. Lemberg is now known as Lviv and is part of the country of Ukraine, which is in the news a lot today. They then would have taken the train from Lemberg through Krakow and onto Prague, and from Prague, continuing on west, cross the German border to somewhere along the Main River, probably the town of Bamberg in Germany. It's not noted on the map here, but that is the highest location where they could pick up one of the river boats that plied the Main and the Rhine River. They would then have sailed down the Main River through Frankfurt, onto the Rhine River, and then north through Cologne and Dusseldorf, and then west out to the mouth of the Rhine River and Rotterdam. So this is a picture of the river boats of that era passing by the famous rock along the Rhine known as the Lorelei. Oh, this is Rotterdam, circa 1910. This is where they would arrive after a 1,000-mile journey from Pasieki, sometime in early May 1911, at which time they would have booked passage in steerage along with 480 other passengers on the SS Volturno, which sailed from Rotterdam on May 18th, 1911. This is the SS Volturno. I can't imagine how they stuffed 480 people onto this boat, but they did. And here is the record of them having been on that ship. As we see here, line number 10 is Anton Gemborys. Here it's spelled Geborrys, and that in fact is a legitimate Polish spelling of the name Gemborys. And on line 11, we see my grandmother, Anastazja. If we go over to the right, we see that in fact they are countries of birth was Russia, but the race of people is Polish. Interesting that the word race has changed in its meaning over the past 100 years. Their final destination, as noted here, is Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. So a little bit about steerage, the conditions under which they sailed for their journey across the North Atlantic. I just read you the last paragraph. This is an actual quote from a female passenger in steerage, not my grandmother, but this is what she noted in her journal, her diary. I'm not certain where exactly it came from. But it reads, "Everything was dirty, sticky, and disagreeable to the touch. Every impression was offensive. Worse than this was the general air of immorality. For 15 hours each day, I witnessed all around me this improper, indecent, and forced mingling of men and women who were total strangers and often did not understand one word of the same language." So this is the conditions under which my grandmother and her uncle lived for 10 days as they crossed the North Atlantic. This is a rendering of someone's impression of what the steerage compartment looked like. I'd say that in comparison to the account that I just read you, this is a rather sanitized version of what steerage must have been like. After 10 days at sea, crossing the North Atlantic, they then arrived in the port of Halifax, Nova Scotia on May 28, 1911. They had a total of $16 in their pocket. That sounds like a paltry amount, but in fact, in today's money, it's about $500. So they weren't destitute. Immediately after disembarking, they would head to this building. This is the Intercolonial Railway Station, from which they would have begin a rail journey across Canada. So this is a map of the Canadian railway system of that era. We see here the line in green. This is the Intercolonial Railway Station. They boarded in Halifax, as I mentioned, and they would have taken that to Quebec. In Quebec, they would have transferred to either the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway line, or more likely the Canadian Pacific Railway line. I think they probably took the Canadian Pacific Railway line because, as you note, the Grand Trunk does not seem to go through any towns. I think it was probably more of a freight express line taking the goods, the agricultural products of Manitoba east for export out of Quebec. So I think they probably more likely took the Canadian Pacific line because they go through towns and whatever where they could get provisions. This is what they would have encountered as they got off the train in Winnipeg when they arrived in early June 1911. This is Main Street. And as you'll note, the flags that are flying are the Union Jack, because if you remember your world history, Canada at that time was part of the British Empire. It was not an independent country. So a little bit of a summary here, what we've talked about so far. They departed, Anastazja and Anton departed Pashieki probably in mid-April to avoid the mud season. Anastazja at that time was 22 years of age. She was unmarried, but unlike most girls who were married by their mid-teens and already had children. 6 of her siblings were still at home. The youngest was 2 years of age. So it was time for Anastazja to move on. So accompanied by her uncle Anton, age 27, Anton was the youngest brother of Anastazja's father, Jakob. So in April, they crossed the border from Russia to Galicia, as I said, probably under the light of the full moon. They then traveled 1,000 miles by rail, on foot, and or riverboat to the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. They departed Rotterdam on May 18th, 1911, on the SS Volturno. After a brief stop in Portsmouth, they sailed on to Halifax, a journey of 3,000 miles across the North Atlantic. They arrived in Halifax on the 28th of May, 1911, and then commenced a 2,100-mile rail journey on their intercolonial and Canadian Pacific Railways from Halifax to Winnipeg, Manitoba, which probably took about 4 days. So a total of 6,000 miles from Pashieki to Winnipeg. So where did they go once they got to Winnipeg? Well, here we see the 1911 Canadian census. And if we look at lines number 25, we see Anthony Gemborys, and line 27, Nastya Gemborys. Nastya is a diminutive for Anastazja. They're living at the home of Vasil and Rose Picula. And Vasil and Rose have 2 children, Vasil Jr. and Francis. So who are the Piculas? So this is the family of Vasil and Rose Picula. Rose, in fact, was Anastazja's maternal aunt. She was the sister of Anastazja's mother, Katarzyna. So it's likely that Anastazja was going to Winnipeg to help her aunt raise her children. The older 2 children in the background are Vasil and Francis, who were 1 and 3 years of age when Anastazja arrived. So this photo obviously was taken much later. When Anastazja arrived, Rose was pregnant with her 3rd child, who is Paulina, who is the girl on the far right in this photo. So moving forward to 1914, so about Anastazja had been living with her Aunt Rose and her Uncle Vasil in Winnipeg for about 3.5 years. In September 1914, my grandfather and Joseph arrived in Winnipeg from Minneapolis. He had immigrated also from this same area, actually from Austria, in 1911 to Minneapolis to live with his older sister. And in September, he relocated from Minneapolis to Winnipeg. This is probably a situation of a matchmaking by Anastazja's aunt Rose and a childhood friend of my grandfather by the name of Paul Trad. Both Rose Picula and Paul Trad and their families were members of the Holy Ghost Catholic Church. So That's why my thinking that it was probably a matchmaking between Rose Picula and Paul Trad that my grandparents came together. Regardless of how they got together, they were married on 20 October 1914 at Holy Ghost Catholic Church in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Their first child was born December 27th, 1950. His name was John Kolasa. Unfortunately, John only lived 2.5 months. He died March 12th, 1916. This was just one day before my grandfather's 28th birthday. What a great birthday present. This is a picture of Holy Ghost Church, where my grandparents were married. This building no longer exists. It was torn down, and a new modern building was built in its place sometime in the 1960s or 70s. And this photo, these fine gentlemen are the clergy, and I think probably some of the senior lay members of Holy Ghost Catholic Church. On the far left, we see Father Stoyer. He was the priest who married my grandparents. And on the far right, we see with the distinguished beard and the crucifix neatly tucked into his cummerbund, Father Kowalski. He was the priest who baptized my Uncle John. This building is Union Station in Winnipeg. This is where my grandmother Anastazja, her uncle Anton, would have arrived in 1911 in Winnipeg, and where my grandfather would have arrived in September 1914. We zoom in a bit, and we'll see that in the background are the freight yards of the rail system. This is probably where my grandfather worked when he lived in Winnipeg. And as you note, there's a bridge also in the background. This bridge crosses over the Red River. And just kind of like to the right of the middle of the bridge is the neighborhood where my grandparents lived. This photo is a direct overhead of the same area. And you'll note the line in red, which is the route that my grandfather took in December 1916 when he left home to take the train out of Union Station to return to Minneapolis and to his older sister's home in Minneapolis. His older sister was Josefa, to make arrangements for he and Anastazja to relocate to Minneapolis. This was probably because Joseph wanted to get out of Canada, because it was late 1916 and Canada was being called upon by London to provide more and more and more troops for the war effort in the trenches in France. And about 2 weeks later, my grandmother followed Joseph en route to Minneapolis on January 9th, 1917. The air temperature that day in Winnipeg was 11 degrees below zero. The wind was blowing about 20 miles an hour, so the wind chill factor was about 30 degrees below zero. And there was about 12 inches of snow on the ground. So in the distance to Union Station from their home on the far side of the Red River was about a mile. So imagine, if you will, 5'1" Anastazja, 6 months pregnant with my Uncle Stanley, plodding her way on her own through the snow and frigid cold with all her bags to get to the streetcar line that would take her to Union Station to begin the 500-mile journey to Minneapolis to join her husband, my grandfather, Joseph. This is the back of her immigration record. And you note that she was afflicted with pregnancy of 6 months. When I read this, I wonder to myself, how might Anastasia be received at the U.S. border today as a 6-month pregnant, unaccompanied, illiterate Polish-Russian asylum seeker looking to join her husband in the United States? So this is a summary of my grandparents' married life. As I mentioned, they were married October 20th, 1914, and their marriage ended April 18th, 1925, when my grandmother died. So almost exactly 10.5 years, or 126 months. During that time, my grandmother bore 8 pregnancies. So 72 months, or 60% of her married life, she was pregnant. We factor in the number of months that she was probably nursing those new babies. a conservative estimate of 40 months. The total time would be 112 months, or 90% of my grandmother's marriage to my grandfather. She was pregnant or nursing infants. So this is her overall immigration legacy. She lived in North America for a little over 14 years. During that time frame, she had 8 children. 4 of those 8 children had children of their own, for a total of 28 grandchildren, of which I am one. Today, there are more than 100 great and 2 times great-grandchildren of Anastazja. I'd say this is a pretty good legacy for an illiterate Polish-Russian peasant girl. As I mentioned before, Anastazja died April 18th, 1925, age 36. This was just 7 days after the birth of her 8th child, a son also named John, like his firstborn brother. She never became a citizen of either Canada or the USA. And technically, because of the geopolitical changes after World War I in Europe, she essentially died a stateless person. Russia no longer controlled the area where she was born and raised, and because she had never been a citizen of Poland, she was not a Polish citizen either. So this is a picture of myself with my sister and our cousin, Robert Kolasa. He is the son of my Uncle Joseph Kolasa Jr., sitting next to the grave marker of our grandmother, Anastazja. So I'll leave you with this epilogue, and I'll let you read it for yourself.